Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm your host, Tanya Granick-Allen. COVID has taken a toll on society, and while the dust seems to be settling on COVID, there are still questions surrounding the number of deaths from COVID and the deaths related to lockdown effects, such as overdoses, suicides, and dying while waiting for medical treatments. So did COVID bring about excess deaths, or were we in the normal and expected range of a typical year? Were lockdowns and the so-called secondary pandemics contributors to excess deaths, or is this all hype? So many of us had our lives upended by COVID that I think it's time that we examine the data. Well, we have a treat for you today. I have invited Dr. Jim Mason as a guest on Counterpoint. Dr. Mason has a degree in engineering physics and a PhD in experimental nuclear physics. His doctoral research and much of his career involved extensive analysis of noisy data to extract useful information, which was then further analyzed to identify meaningful relationships indicative of underlying causes. He's currently retired and living near Lakefield, Ontario. He recently published a research paper in the C2C Journal titled, "Did the Virus or Governments Kill More Canadians? A Statistical Analysis of Excess Deaths During the Pandemic." Welcome, Dr. Mason. Thank you so much for joining me today. So a first question is, many of us have these sentiments, or we're curious about these things. What led you to want to write this paper?
Well, I followed the numerology, if you like, of COVID-19 right from the very start. So I was kind of into the numbers. And at one time I thought, the cases doesn't seem to be a very sensible metric for actually managing the pandemic. Seems to me like excess deaths would be a better one. So I had analyzed the cases thing quite extensively in a couple of other C2C Journal articles. So I finally got around to thinking, well, let's see what it says about excess deaths. Have there been any? What were they like? Were there a lot? Were there not very many? How did that all pan out? So that's kind of what got me interested in it.
So let's, do a deep dive into the data, because people want to say, well, show me the proof. So how did you go about gathering? So first thing is, folks will want to know, well, is this data accurate? How did you gather this statistical information?
Okay, I use data from Statistics Canada. They publish a report that lists the number of monthly deaths, all causes, every year. They keep updating it every year. And I got the data from 2010 to 2021. And the first thing I did was to plot that up and see what it looks like. And if we can show that first slide, we can share that with everybody else.
Yeah, we see it right here. So there's monthly deaths in blue, and then green is the population. So you can see the population curve is steadily growing, and sort of so does these, peaks and valleys of monthly deaths.
Yes. One of the reasons for looking at that was that a lot of people think that if you just look at the average number of deaths over the last 5 years, say, that you would get an estimate of what you would expect to see this year. But clearly, when the number of deaths is increasing year over year, that's not the case. So you have to take that increase into account. And I did that by fitting a straight line, which we can see on the next slide, if we can show that, to the part of the graph that corresponds to the summer. They all seem to be mostly the same and quite different from the winter periods. But the summer periods fell on a very good straight line, at least from 2012 to 2019. Now, that was the part I used to project the number of expected deaths in 2020 and 2021, because you don't want to use those in estimating your projection, because that's now confusing the issue somewhat.
Okay, and I can see by this graphic, it's very clear that you're right. That line is pretty steady, and there are peaks, when it's the winter months, not surprising, we're Canada, northern climate, and then there's valleys during the summer months when I suppose deaths are lower.
Yes, that winter peak includes obviously the normal flu season that we think of, and there are a lot of other reasons why the deaths go up in that. And so the first thing I did was to subtract off that average increase, or the increase that's going on from year to year, and then count and then look at the shape of those jagged peaks, which I refer to as mountain ranges. And if you look at those over a succession of time, they look like they also are increasing, but they have a very common shape. And if we can show the next slide, that would show the common shape that they all have. And then can we have that?
There we go.
That's the one. Good. Yes.
Yes, okay, I see. Yes.
It's remarkably consistent from year to year, except for 2020 and 2021, which are quite different.
Okay, now we've got to cut to commercial break, but when we get back, I want to dive a little bit deeper into that slide because I want you to explain a couple of those peaks that seem unusual. We'll be right back after this break.
Excellent.